Hi, welcome to another edition of This Issue. My guest this time is Dahr Jamail, who's an independent journalist. Recently he's been to Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, and he's here to talk to us about what's been going on in that part of the world. Dahr, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Bruce.
Great to have you here. Dahr, you're on a speaking tour of Maine right now. You've been up to Bangor and spoke in Portland the other night as well. How's the tour been going?
It's been going really well. It's a lot of fun to come to Maine. Great folks here, really well organized tour thanks to Kate Harris and some other folks, and it's gone well. Really good reception and good crowds.
Good. What is an independent journalist? People might be a little confused by that title.
And I call myself an independent journalist just to make it really clear that I don't work for a corporate outlet. I don't embed with the U.S. military, that I freelance basically. I do write regularly for some outlets like Interpress Service Online and then some others, newspapers like The Independent or The Guardian. But by giving myself a title of independent journalist, I do that to make really clear that I don't conform into corporate media standards of objective journalism and I think more importantly, or just as importantly, is that I don't embed with the military, because I don't feel that's journalism.
And lately you've had stories published by the Asia Times, you've done work for the BBC, and as you said, The Guardian and The Independent, those are British newspapers. So you've done a lot of work for a lot of other international publications. Yeah,
that's kind of the irony, is that I went over to Iraq and to the Middle East to report on what was happening there, with the hopes that more people in the United States would get this information. And ironically, while I have reported for some U.S. outlets like Democracy Now!, most of my print journalism has gone over to European outlets.
That's interesting. That is it that American media just don't want to cover the story? What do you think the reason is that you have a hard time getting placed in American publications?
My experience from my very first trip to Iraq was just that the corporate media and the larger newspapers just didn't seem very interested in covering the stories. I'll give you an example. I was still trying to get stories into the bigger outlets back here. And for example, in January '04, so this is, it was a little over 4 months before the 60 Minutes 2 program ran their special on Abu Ghraib showing the photos. And you know, anyone in Iraq and Baghdad walking the streets for a day or two is going to run into people and start hearing about these stories of torture, not just in Abu Ghraib, but from most military detention centers across Iraq. And that started happening to me. So in January '04, I had a story about torture, about Army medic complicity in that torture. I had photographs, I had Army documentation, and with a colleague who had worked for the AP, we wrote it up as a hard news story, and I sent it out to all of the major newspapers in the U.S. That I could think of. I found about 150. We did. And I said, look, go cover this story. I'm not interested in my name or fame or money. Send one of your own reporters, but this is all over the place here. Go cover it. No one even replied. And so at that point, after that was basically the culmination of a series of attempts to try to get this information into the mainstream. And after that, I just decided, you know, it's going to probably be a lot more effective and certainly a lot easier to just find outlets that will run the story, so I can just get busy instead of beating my head against the wall trying to break through this obvious glass ceiling into the corporate media. And so that's when I decided, all right, I'm just going to stick with alternative media and Democracy Now!, Interpress Service, and then some of the publications that you mentioned.
Well, let's talk about you for a second. How did you get started as an independent journalist? I know you were living in Alaska at some point and then jumped right in. Tell us that story, how you got going.
Yeah, I'm from Houston, Texas originally. I lived in Alaska after I graduated. A few years after that, I ended up moving up to Alaska in '96 and was living up there. And I was doing some freelancing for a local weekly alternative newspaper up there, and mostly writing about mountaineering trips. I was working as a mountain guide on Mount McKinley, and then doing rescues with the Park Service up there. And I was writing those up in the newspaper. And then after 9/11, we started to get a little bit political and write about, well, why did this happen? Let's look at Reagan's policies regarding Afghanistan during the '80s. And then after a few weeks of that, we got the editor got fired because we were too political for the advertisers, and it was yet another lesson in how media worked in the U.S., even with alternative papers in a city. And that kind of put the lid on what I felt like I could really do to express dissent and try to work towards getting the truth out to people about what this government was doing. And then when the drums to war against Iraq started, and then February 15, 2003 came and went and was brushed aside as a focus group by the Bush administration, I decided, the usual means of expressing dissent are clearly not being effective. I need to do something else. And I figured that they were only getting away with what they were getting away with by controlling the media, and the corporate media being so complicit, which is clear to anyone with a pulse now that their complicity is just glaringly apparent. And so I decided I would go over to Iraq and do what I could to write about what I was seeing.
And now how many times have you been back to Iraq?
The first time I went was November 2003, and then I've been on a total of 4 trips. The last time I was there was February 2005. And then since that time, I've been covering it by either going to Jordan and using sources inside of Iraq and writing about it from there, or doing the same from even over here now. And I have gone back and written stories from Jordan, from Turkey, and then more recently from Lebanon and the war there.
So in a nutshell, what's the main thing that you think you've learned about the U.S. occupation of Iraq? And what the most important thing that the average American should know about that from your experience?
I think the most important thing is that there was never an intention to go over and help the Iraqi people or to liberate the Iraqi people. This wasn't about bringing liberation to the Iraqi people. It was more about liberating Iraq from the Iraqi people so that the U.S. could sit on these oil reserves before Russia and China got to them. There was never any plan to really rebuild or reconstruct or rehabilitate the infrastructure of Iraq. It was about corporate looting so that companies like the Bechtels and the Halliburtons would be paid billions of dollars in contracts and not actually be forced to carry out this work. There's basically been no oversight there. So I think just it's clear that the military has been used not for national security, but as sort of a corporate policeman to go in there and protect U.S. interest in that country, which at this point is primarily oil infrastructure and military bases, so they can keep projecting military might deeper into East Asia.
Because you were not embedded, you had a lot of opportunity to, I think, get to know local people there in Iraq, probably in a deeper way. Is that true? And what was your sense, and what do you know, and what do you hear that the Iraqi people feel about the U.S. occupation today?
Yeah, working as an independent reporter and not going around with the military, or if you're a corporate journalist there, you're going around with private security guards and such. And by going out in and talking directly with the Iraqi people, it wasn't rocket science for me to figure out that I'm going to get different information if I'm talking to these people not from inside of a Humvee, not surrounded by soldiers. I'm probably going to get different information from doctors in Fallujah when I do that, as opposed to if I roll in there in a tank. So clearly people felt naturally much more comfortable just talking with me, opening up, seeing I was just there with an interpreter with my notepad, wanting to hear what they had to say. And then really what I learned over all these trips, and it was apparent from the beginning and then increased over time as the occupation ground on, was that the mood of the Iraqi people against the occupation was that more and more people over time were against it, culminating to where even today, a recent poll came out 2 days ago that found 75% of the people in Baghdad are opposed to the occupation. They want the occupation in immediately. Other polls have suggested as high as 90% of Iraqis are vehemently opposed to the occupation, and that's more in line of what I saw on the ground, that people became very aware very fast that there's no reconstruction going on. They didn't come here to help us. They're here, they have no intention of leaving. And that, coupled with all of the violence and chaos and suffering, obviously it's a no-brainer to see that people are very upset with it and want it to go away.
Now the United States, it's reported, and you've reported this as well, is building some number, anywhere between 6 and a dozen, you've said, permanent bases, what they call enduring bases. What does this mean? What are these bases like? Can you tell us a bit about these permanent bases, and are they now built in Iraq? What status are they at today?
They are working to build, it is between 6 and 12 bases. We don't know exactly at the end of the day how many bases they will settle on there. We know the minimum number will most likely be 6, maximum of 12. And these bases, they won't call them permanent bases. I'll call them that because that's what they are. But it's semantics. They've chosen to, they think it's bad PR, and it is bad PR to say, yeah, we're building permanent bases in Iraq. So they don't call it that. They say instead that they just want permanent access into these areas. And they made that very clear 10 days into the occupation. U.S. military officials were talking about, we don't need permanent bases, we just need permanent access. And this has in fact been included, and I'm paraphrasing, but this has been included in the so-called Iraqi Constitution, which is a document that was written in English and translated into Arabic. But permanent access by a foreign power for Iraq's security to get into certain locations when necessary is basically the paraphrase of how that's been included in the Iraqi so-called constitution. And these bases, what most people here aren't aware of is that they're so huge. Like one that I talk about when I give presentations is Camp Anaconda in Balad, which is just outside of Baghdad, and it's an air base. There's 20,000 soldiers, less than 1,000 of whom ever leave the base. There's 250 aircraft at this base alone. It has its own first-run movie theater, concrete troop barracks with air-conditioned internet, overseas phones, cable television, 2 base exchanges where they sell all the latest high-tech gear and CDs and iPods and DVDs and televisions. And then they have very, very lavish cafeteria for the troops. There's also a 24-hour Burger King, a Subway sandwich shop, Popeye's fried chicken, Starbucks coffee outlet, Hertz rental car, so people can drive cars around the base, I guess. And just very, very intense, deep infrastructure in these bases. There's swimming pools, barber shops. And then if we get into, if we talk about the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad that's being built as we speak in the Green Zone, one of the few construction projects that's happening there right on schedule. We're talking about an embassy that's 2/3 the size of the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Again, calling it an embassy is just a little bit misleading. This is a compound of 21 buildings, the size of the Vatican City. Again, it has the largest swimming pool in the country, movie theaters, yoga studios, beauty salons, barber shops, a school for the kids of obviously the children, not Iraqi children, but children of some of the 8,000 government officials that will be stationed there.
Meant to be there a while.
Obviously.
And these bases and this embassy and everything else, they have running water and electricity?
They have their own water treatment plants. They have their own electrical systems completely independent from the Iraqi
So the Iraqi people who we supposedly went to liberate today still don't have regular electricity. They don't have regular sanitation, water, everything else, correct?
Their infrastructure on every level that you look at is far worse today than it was under Saddam Hussein, including how much oil is being exported from the country.
Would you say that the government, the so-called elected government of Iraq today is a puppet government of the United States?
Without a doubt, it's a puppet government. It's very clear that Maliki basically didn't become prime minister until they were the Bush and Blair administrations became unhappy with the job the previous fellow was doing, so they sent over Condoleezza Rice and Jack Straw to have a little quick meeting with him and push him out and bring in Maliki. Now there's even some talk that they're going to do the same with Maliki because he's become so unpopular. They are a puppet government. They do not respect the wishes of the Iraqi people because, as I said before, as much as 90% of the population wants an immediate withdrawal, and then you have a government in Iraq, a very clear puppet government that instead of asking for withdrawal has Talibani coming on television in just the last week saying, no, we want permanent bases.
61% of the American people, according to the latest polls, say they want us to get out of Iraq. They think the war is a mess, that it's unwinnable. Our congressman in this 1st congressional district here in Maine, Tom Allen, has voted 7 times now to fund the war, to a tune of $354 billion. And there's a growing number of people in our district that say that money could be used, if we brought the troops home, that money could be used for health care back in this country, for education, for creating good jobs. But he says we've got to support the troops. That he says he's against the war, but he's just supporting the troops. How would you, if you had a chance to talk to our Congressman Tom Allen, and he was telling you that, oh, I'm against the war, but I've voted 7 times just to support the troops, what would you say to him?
I think it needs to be made very clear that people like Tom Allen and our government is filled with so-called Democrats like this that say that they're against the war, but we're going to vote on down the line lockstep with all of these funding measures. I think we have to point to a hypocrite when we see one, and it's very hypocritical to say that, well, I'm against the war, but we have to support the troops. Well, you cannot fight a war without money, and you cannot fight a war without troops. And if any politician is going to say they support the troops, then the first thing they need to be doing is getting them home right away. And then the second thing they need to be doing is making sure that there is no more funding going into Iraq. This occupation is costing nearly $2 billion every single week, and we're all paying for it by not having health care, by not having social programs, by not having education better funded. And people like this that say this, it's really infuriating to me, and I wish that more people in this country would wake up and see that this person's not really acting like a real Democrat if he's supposed to be in an opposition party. He's not being against this war, and actually he's not supporting the troops. He's saying he's supporting the troops, and instead he's supporting bills that are sending more money, more soldiers to Iraq, that are extending the tours of National Guardsmen there and doing absolutely nothing to bring this illegal occupation to an end.
Why do you say it's illegal?
It is illegal. It contravenes the Geneva Conventions. It was very clearly a war of aggression. Even Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the UN, has come out and said on BBC quite a ways back, I think it's over a year ago now, said that this was a violation of the Geneva Conventions. It's a violation of international law. It's a war of aggression, which is the mother of all war crimes.
And this money, about $8 billion a month that we're now spending on this Iraq war, a lot of that money is drifting off into the profits of these big corporations, Halliburton, Bechtel, others, correct? And they're not delivering a lot of what they're supposed to be delivering. Isn't that true?
Not even close. I was hired by Public Citizen, a watchdog group out of DC, to look very closely at Bechtel's contract regarding the water infrastructure. And in a quick summation, I went to 3 cities that were actually named in the contract where they were supposed to have done water infrastructure rehabilitation contracts or projects. And what I found was that after interviewing the engineers or the assistant engineers at each of these water plants, was that the best case scenario, one of them said, some people from Bechtel came here and they replaced some of our sand water filters, but that didn't actually produce more potable water. The other 2 water plants basically said Bechtel who. And so it's clearly a situation where that has led to massive suffering on the ground, where there's rampant waterborne diseases, cholera, kidney stones, nausea, diarrhea. People are literally dying from not having clean water. It's worse now than it was during the sanctions, a time where 1 million people died, children and adults alike, from not having medicine, not having water, not having clean water particularly. And this is just one example of what it looks like on the ground when these companies like the Bechtels and the Halliburtons, Bechtel's been awarded now over $3.8 billion of contracts, being paid out in full for some of these contracts, totaling over $1 billion they've been paid out in full so far. And yet, they are not being, there is no oversight. They're not held to account for not doing this work on the ground. Halliburton's been paid out for billions of dollars of their contracts already and have been awarded contracts over $12 billion so far.
By continuing to fund the war, these politicians are really enabling Bush, and they're also enabling these big corporations who are ripping off the American people and the Iraqi people as well.
It's literal corporate looting. It's basically funneling U.S. taxpayer money. 50% of all of our taxes go into the military one way or another, and it's funneling all of that money into these corporations who are literally just making record profits, more money they've ever made in their history, and not being held to account to do any of the work they're being paid to do in Iraq.
I want to switch gears to Lebanon for a moment. During this recent Lebanon-Israeli war that was going on, you were in Lebanon during the time, I think, that some of the really atrocious Israeli attacks on civilians was held. Can you tell us about what you saw while you were in Lebanon?
My time in Lebanon, I was there I went in about 7-8 days into the conflict, and I stayed for roughly the middle 2 weeks of this 34-day war of aggression against Lebanon. It really wasn't a war. It was a war of aggression by the Israeli military against Lebanon. And what I saw in general was the collective punishment of an entire country at the hands of the Israeli government and the Israeli military. The first target hit, there was the Hezbollah operation carried out where they captured 2 Israeli soldiers and killed several others. And then the next morning, the first target hit by the Israeli military, it wasn't Hezbollah, it was Beirut's International Airport. They dropped 2 massive bombs on the main runway of that airport, and then proceeded over the next several weeks to bomb over 80 bridges, over 90 roads, milk plants, pharmaceutical plants, food plants, paper plants, hospitals, ambulances, medical workers, and primarily civilians.
Why did they do that?
They even said, their military said even, we're going to try to pressure the Lebanese people to pressure Hezbollah to disarm, to move away from the border of Israel, and to hand back over the captured Israeli soldiers.
And did that strategy of Israel's work?
That strategy basically caused a situation in Lebanon before this war where actually the majority of the people in Lebanon did not support Hezbollah. To 2 weeks into the war, 87% of the population of Lebanon then supported Hezbollah because they were so infuriated by the fact that at the end of the day, over 1,000 civilian casualties were generated by Israeli bombs. And it turned the Lebanese population, which was already opposed to Israeli policy in Lebanon, but it turned them very much against them. And not only that, but very much in support of Hezbollah.
Do you think that the United States and Israel are going to attack Iran? Seymour Hersh at the New Yorker has been writing stories where he's hearing from people inside of the Pentagon, his sources, saying that plans are underway to attack Iran. In fact, he's also reported that the United States now has troops inside of Iran, special forces troops. Do you think that the U.S. and Israel are going to actually do some kind of an attack against Iran?
All of the signs that war is imminent are there. Much of the information I have is from what Seymour Hersh has put out, but also from some of the signs I've seen in Iraq with troop buildups, where these bases are located. And we do know for sure that special ops are on the ground in Iran and have been there for over a year. They have been planned. Some of the bombs that have happened in Iran and some of the plane crashes are direct results of these special ops. They are trying to generate instability within the country and team up with resistance group like the Mujahideen al-Khalq and some of the Kurdish rebels there, and to work with them to start to undermine the government's goals in that country, the Iranian government goals. And then we look at the fact that a big Navy battle group is about to be sent over, I think starting October 1st, sent over to the Gulf with mine-laying ships as well for Iranian ports. And I really do think that it does appear quite imminent at this point. I think the debate is not if, but when. Is it going to happen sometime just before the November elections that are right upon us, or is it going to happen sometime in the next year and a half or so that this regime has left in office? But it really does look frightfully imminent at this point that an attack will occur, and there will be absolutely disastrous results, far worse than what we've seen in Iraq.
I recently, about a month ago, heard from some people I know in the military that told me that Navy personnel had been sent to Israel, U.S. Navy personnel, and their job was targeting cruise missile. And so they were meeting with Israeli military to identify cruise missile targets. And as you probably know, cruise missiles are the first strike sneak attack weapons. Their only purpose is to launch a first strike attack against a particular country. When we did the invasion of Iraq, these cruise missiles were fired off Aegis destroyers that are built right here nearby Bath. and they were used to hit Iraq as a first attack. And so these Navy personnel are now have been sent over to Israel to work with the United States and Israel to identify first strike, a target for attack in Israel. So I agree that something is going to happen. Why do you think that the United States wants to attack Iran? Do you think it's about weapons of mass destruction, or do you think it's about widening the war, controlling their oil ultimately?
Well, it's the latter, clearly, because all of the intelligence agencies in the U.S. Say that the closest Iran could possibly be to a nuclear weapon is 5 years out. That's the absolute closest, and others say maybe 10 or even 12 years out. And it's clearly not about that. All of this rhetoric about Iran didn't even really start until just after the January 30/05 elections in Iraq, and it's increased greatly much more recently. But I think it's about, with controlling Iraq, the U.S. now is situated where they have much more control over the flow and the price of oil, and more importantly so that upcoming superpowers like Russia, particularly China and possibly India, can't get to those resources. And with Iran, by controlling Iran and the Caspian Sea reserves, the natural gas that's there, basically we will then have total economic power over the Chinas, the Russias, and the Indias. And I think that's what this is about, that Iraq is the first step in this plan. It was not the last step, and Iran is very clearly going to be a very, very large step in having global military control.
If the United States, we only have 2 minutes left, so very quickly, if the United States does go forward with Israel in this attack of Iran, what are the implications likely to be throughout the entire region?
The entire region, I think, would go into open war at that point. Clearly, Iran's going to pull out all the stops. Hezbollah will launch basically most of the rockets they have left into northern Israel. Israel's going to suffer greatly. They will retaliate, possibly using nuclear weapons if they feel their survival is threatened. Russia and China will immediately be pulled into the conflict. All of the oil infrastructure in the Gulf will be immediately attacked by Iran. We can expect oil to go up well over $100 a barrel, possibly even as much as $200. There will be a massive oil shortage. Our economy is going to be in a massive crisis almost overnight, and the entire region in the Middle East will be in flames. And the U.S. troops in Iraq will be wishing that it was only 2.5 a day being killed, which is what's happening today. We'll be wishing that it was that low.
Because the Shia who are allied to Iran would turn against the U.S. even greater than they have now, right?
Exactly. Iran basically is in total control of southern Iraq and arguably most of Baghdad already to date. The main supply line goes from Kuwait to Baghdad for the U.S. military, and that would immediately be cut.
Well, Dahr, thank you very much for coming on the show. I'm going to give you just remaining time, maybe about a minute or so. Give us any closing words. As a journalist who has been throughout this region of the Middle East, here's a chance to talk to some American people. If you would, wear a hat of an Iraqi person and speak to the audience in these last 30 seconds on behalf of the people of Iraq.
I think American people need to fully understand the implications of this occupation and how much the Iraqi people are suffering today. Iraq is a failed state. It's been completely shattered. Over 2 million people have already left. Those who can't leave have had to stay, and they're suffering daily. And I really believe the American people haven't done enough to try to bring this occupation to an end, despite some titanic efforts of some people. Clearly more needs to be done to bring this illegal occupation to an end, because until that happens, over 100 people a day are being killed there. Soldiers are being killed there every single day, wounded every single day. And clearly it's time to redouble efforts that are already in the works to bring this to an end.
Thank you, Dahr. Thank you very much. And thank you for watching another edition of This Issue. Until next time, good luck to you all, and please get organized.